Hey y'all, I'm Hope, and today I'm going to be doing the If I Could Only Keep 10 Books challenge. I have a little bit of daylight left today because I got off work a little bit early for the holidays, so it seemed like a good opportunity to film a little bit. But I saw this challenge a few days ago over on Hillary at Melted Books, her channel. She just did this challenge a few days ago, and I thought it looked like a lot of fun and like a really interesting way to think about the books on my shelves. I think this was originally created by Amy Myers, so I'm going to link both Hillary's video and Amy's video in the description below so you can check those out. But I just thought this seemed like it'd be fun and an interesting kind of thought experiment looking at my shelves. So these aren't in any particular order, I just have them stacked on my desk, and let's just dive into them. The first one I chose is The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. I chose this in part because this cover is beautiful, and I actually just got this edition a few days ago. My tall partner was with me when I went to Barnes & Noble. I would not have otherwise found this book, but he was looking at the top shelves and he was like, hey, this is a really pretty edition of this book that you love. And I was like, you are right, I wish to have it. I just actually heard of these a few days before that. This is the Seasons edition, and they've only printed 10,000 of each of the books in this line. And I was never expecting to actually find one of these, but he happened to spot one up on a top shelf. So I was very excited to come across this and be able to purchase it. I was lucky that I was able to do that. So that's part of the reason that I've chosen this one. The other reason is I just love everything Sherlock Holmes, and I have this shelf right here, which is a Sherlock Holmes and Sherlock Holmes related shelf. Everything on there, excluding the Limby Bear, is Sherlock Holmes or Sherlock Holmes related. And so since I had that whole collection, I really felt like I wanted to keep at least one thing off of that shelf. And I decided to go with this one, also in part because it's the only book on this list that I have here that I haven't actually read in its entirety yet. So I've read several of the stories in this, but I haven't read all of them. And as the inside cover of this notes, this is a selection of the author's favorites. So I think that that's a good reason to hold on to it, is that I love some of the stories I've already read, and I have some more to look forward to that I know are some of the author's favorites. The next book I have is The Goblin Emperor by Catherine Addison. This one happens to be a Spanish edition because I'm trying to practice reading in Spanish. I'm applying for some MA in English programs, and all the ones I'm looking at have like a language requirement. So since I already have taken several years of Spanish, it seemed natural to just go with that. So I'm using this one to try and practice, and as much as I love this cover, I would probably actually keep my English edition, but this one looks really nice on camera, so we grabbed this one out today. But this one is a fantasy story that follows this guy named Maya who unexpectedly becomes the emperor of the Elvish Empire after the death of his father and his half-brothers. And so it's about Maya having to like figure out how to navigate their society and kind of grapple with the fucked upness of it while also trying to figure out how to be a good leader. So there's a lot of stuff going on here. I love Maya as a protagonist. He's very much a cinnamon roll, and I just really enjoy reading from his perspective because the world that he's in is very fucked up. But the book ends up being very comforting just because Maya is such a warm, optimistic person. So I really enjoyed that about it. It also has tons of really fascinating side characters, all of whom I would gladly read an entire book about. And then there's also lots of other interesting things happening thematically as well. So this is a book that I feel like I could read it a lot of times and never get everything out of it just because there is so much to find. So that's kind of the main reason I want to hold on to this one. It's one of my favorite books of all time, and I just feel like I would get a lot of reread value out of it. Up next, I've got one of my favorite classics, which is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I had to read this originally for a summer reading project when I was getting ready to start my senior year of high school. We did a whole like monster-themed senior reading project, which was a lot of fun actually. But this is a book that I was surprised by how much I liked it and how accessible it is in terms of classics. Like, Mary Shelley's writing, I think it's just really easy to get into. I didn't have any trouble with this one at all. I think if you were wanting to start reading classics, this one, also Sherlock Holmes obviously, and a couple of other things, or at least one other thing on this list, are good places to start. But this one in particular I really love because I enjoy the story a lot. There's a lot of stuff in here about like Victor Frankenstein's arrogance, and about like that thing about like you spend so much time asking if you could that you never asked if you should. There's a lot of that. But also like the protagonist, Victor Frankenstein, is just super dramatic and ridiculous. Like every time he's mildly inconvenienced, he's like, oh, I'm just going to faint and avoid all of my problems. So there's a lot of like melodrama in it that I think is really fun. And I reference this book all the time. I talk to my friend who was in the same English class We talk about this book all the time still, and I just really enjoy it, and it's one that I would like to reread sometime soon because I have a few retellings of it on my shelf, and I think it would be fun to like do a reread of this and then like read those. But if I only could hold on to one of them, because I can only keep 10 books, this is the one that I would want to hold on to because I just love this so much. And I was surprised at how much I love it as well. Up next, I have another book that is on this list primarily because of reread value. This is a memory called Empire by Arcadia Martine. I really wanted to include the sequel as well, but I haven't read that one, and I was trying to limit myself to books I've already read. But this one, similarly to The Goblin Emperor, just has a lot going on, and I feel like I could reread it and reread it and reread it and still be finding new things to enjoy about it. So I just would love to reread this over and over again and just enjoy all of the interesting things that are happening here. Also, I really love the writing in this one. I know it's one that some people find very dense. I didn't find it dense, but I read it as more being like kind of poetic. Instead, it feels like it flows in a really interesting way. So I enjoyed the writing in this one a lot, which I know a lot of people don't, but for me it really worked, and I really love this book. Next, I've got the only horror book on this list, which is The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. And this is the book that I credit with getting me into the horror genre in terms of books. I was very easily frightened as a child, so I only in the last few years kind of started getting into horror media at all. Started with video games kind of at the beginning of college, and then a couple years in I started getting into horror movies, and now I have read this and have started reading horror books. So, did I say reading horror movies? I meant watching horror movies. I don't know what I just said. But anyway, this got me into the genre of horror books, and I think it's because the characters in here are really well written. I'm very much a character-driven reader, so the fact that the characters in here felt so real to me really impressed me, and I think made the story more impactful than it otherwise would have been for me. And also the ending of this book has really stuck with me, and I think about it quite a lot, even though I read this a year ago. So it has a lot of value to me as the book that got me interested in a genre, and also I think it's a book that would be interesting to revisit now that I know how it ends. Now I have another one that's kind of a different pick for me in terms of my usual reading, which is The Silence of Bones by June Her. Historical mystery is one of my favorite genres, so that's like not surprising, but I don't read a lot of YA books in general. Not for any like dislike of YA, I just haven't found a lot of them that I've really enjoyed. And YA wasn't really a thing, at least at the library that was local to me when I was in kind of the age bracket that it's aimed at. So I haven't really read a lot of it, but this one I kept hearing great things about, and I am so glad that I picked it up because the writing in here I think is phenomenal. It's really beautiful, and I really enjoyed reading, just like the experience of reading this book. I also really like the protagonist of Soul. She's this like 16-year-old girl. She's indentured to the police bureau. She gets involved in a murder investigation, and then there's like this subplot where she's trying to find her missing brother. And just like the way that she was trying to find her brother, and like her familial relationships and her friendship with the inspector that is running the investigation, I just found all of that really fascinating, and I really enjoyed her growth and arc across this story. Also, this is one of the only books I've read this year that actually made me cry. And it not only made me cry when I finished it, the day that I finished it, but also the next day when I was like driving to work, and then later when I was just sitting at my desk, I kept like thinking about the ending of this book and tearing up because it's very bittersweet, but I think it was just so beautifully done, and it just impacted me a lot, and it made me very emotional. So this may be, I'm a little torn on this, but I think this is maybe my favorite historical mystery that I've read. So I absolutely love this one, and I definitely want to reread it at some point as well. It's one where I think there's so many other interesting things happening that it doesn't really matter to me that I already know how the mystery ends, because there's all of this other fascinating stuff happening as well. Up next, I have another book I read this year, which is Gods of Jade and Shadow by Sylvia Moreno Garcia. And I knew when I started this list that I needed to have something by her on this list because I love her writing. I've read like 4 or 5 of her books so far, and I have given one 4.5 star, and everything else has been 5 stars for me. So I knew I needed to have something by her on this list, and I chose this one because I read it, it was literally the first thing that I read this year, and it has really stuck with me, similarly to the way The Only Good Indians has. It's a book that I think about a lot. But this one is a very like fairy tale-esque fantasy adventure about this woman named Cassiopeia who feels very stuck. She's, you know, wanting to escape the small town that she lives in, and she's living there with her extended family who don't treat her very well, but it's like jazz age Mexico and she doesn't have a lot of resources. So she's feeling pretty stuck, and then she accidentally frees a Mayan god of death and ends up going on a road trip across Mexico with him to try and find some missing body parts so that he can reattain his like full godhood and break the bond that is now connecting them. So this is just really fun. There's a lot of adventure, there's a lot of like funny moments, there's a lot of like very heartfelt moments with Cassiopeia and the god that she is traveling with. I think this book also has one of my favorite antagonists. Actually, the Goblin Emperor is another one of my favorite antagonists. But the one in here has a really interesting motivation, which kind of boils down to, I don't want to be obsolete, which I thought was a really interesting motivation for a villain. And then also Cassiopeia's cousin Martine gets to go on a really interesting character arc as well. So I just really enjoyed all of the journeys happening in here, and I think about this book quite a bit. Next up is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, which is one of the first classics that I think I kind of picked up for myself, that I decided on my own that I wanted to read. So it kind of is special to me for that reason, but also I just really enjoy Oscar Wilde's writing. This is very witty and funny, and it's got a lot of interesting themes around like vanity and some things that I don't think they would have used this term for it at the time, but like the halo effect, where like beauty is equated to goodness, and that's kind of how the protagonist of Dorian kind of gets away with all this stuff throughout the book, because he's young and beautiful, and so people kind of tend to see him as blameless regardless of his actual levels of guilt in something. There's also a lot in here about like the consequences of his actions catching up with him. And I think all of that's really interesting, but really I just really enjoy the writing and the dialogue in here. And it's one that I would like to reread soon, and I'd actually like to reread it in conjunction with the uncensored manuscript that Harvard University Press recently found and published. So they found the manuscript before Wilde's editors made him take out a lot of the queer text and queer portions of the story to make it publishable for the time, and they have now published a version of that. And I would really like to read this in conjunction with that new uncensored copy, just to see what's different, because I'm curious. The penultimate pick I have here is, I believe, also a classic. It's from like the 1800s, late 1800s. But this is a play. It's Cyrano Bergerac by Edmond Rostand. I think this was originally published in French. I'm not certain of that, but I think it was. And it's like this very silly but also very sad play about these two guys who are both like infatuated with the same woman. They're both in love with this woman named Roxanne, but one of them, Cyrano, is very smart. He's very good with words, but he's very sensitive about his appearance because he has a big nose, and he's like, you don't insult Cyrano's nose and live to tell the tale. But then he also meets this guy named Christian, who's very attractive, but he's kind of dumb as a brick, and he is really bad with words. And Roxanne is kind of an intellectual, smart, clever woman, and so Christian knows that he's not going to be able to woo her with his inability to speak coherently around her, but Cyrano thinks that she's completely out of his league. So they kind of team up to seduce Roxanne, and it's a very much a book where like hijinks ensue, but there's a lot of very heartfelt emotions in it as well. And it's a play that I really like to come back to from time to time. One, because it is so funny. I really enjoy the wit and humor in here, but also I just think that the emotional impact of the ending is really interesting, and I really enjoyed this one. And then the last book on my list is Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice. I think this might be the oldest one on this list. I first read this in like the 9th or 10th grade, and I think a lot of what the story explores in terms of Louis trying to figure out like who he wants to be and what his place in the world is now that his circumstances have changed, now that he's a vampire. I think a lot of that exploration of his like identity and what kind of a person he wants to be and what he wants to do with his life really resonated with me at the time that I read it when I was in high school, and for that reason this book has just held a special place in my heart for a long time. I've reread it a lot. You can see that the spine is kind of cracked and terrible, and the back is being held together with some duct tape after a trip to the beach kind of weakened it a little bit. But those are the 10 books that I would really want to keep if I can only keep 10. I have a lot of love for these books. I really like all of them. and I would heartily recommend pretty much any book on this list, except maybe The Only Good Indians if you're squeamish, because that one's got quite a bit of gore in it. But on the whole, I would heartily recommend any one of these books. I think they're all fantastic, and I'm pretty happy with this selection. But anyway, I hope that you've enjoyed this video, and if you have, I hope you'll consider giving it a like and maybe even subscribing. Ooh, I'm about to drop this stack. But yeah, thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye!